In 1998, an 18-year-old boy slit the throat of his group leader in the middle of the street. But this wasn't a random attack. It was the climax of a 14-year cosmic nightmare. Meet Eduardo, the man who convinced hundreds of wealthy families to hand over their children to an alien prince. This is the story of the Edelweiss cult, a tale of psychological destruction and how the justice system let the ultimate predator walk free. Dozens of boys, at most no older than 12 years old, stood at attention in the cold weather. They wore military-style uniform. At the center of the formation stood Eduardo González Arenas, a man who was charismatic and cruel. To the outside world, he was a youth instructor leading the Youth Association of Edelweiss Mountain. To the boys shivering in the dark, he was Prince Alain, an extraterrestrial emissary from the distant planet of Delhais, and he demanded total submission from these boys. He constantly spoke of an imminent nuclear apocalypse destined to wipe out humanity in the year 1992, promising that only those who have proved their absolute loyalty to his iron guard would be evacuated aboard an approaching fleet of spaceships. Beyond this bizarre look was a predatory group engineered for the psychological destruction of hundreds of children. The Edelweiss network operated across Spain from 1970 to 1984, and it grew into one of the most expansive and destructive cults in modern European history. Its unraveling would expose the depths of human depravity and the vulnerabilities within Spanish law enforcement and the judicial system, which was not equipped to handle the complex mechanics of coercive control cults and brainwashing. Eduardo González Arenas, who is known to the cult as Eddie, was a malignant narcissist and highly organized psychopath. He was born in Madrid to rich parents. He was a former legionnaire in the Spanish military. However, his military act masked a darker reality. Between 1971 and 1976, police records show he was convicted of multiple counts of fraud. He was a seasoned con artist posing as a spiritual visionary, and he understood that faith and fear were the ultimate currencies for human control. Eddie launched Edelweiss in late 1970, capitalizing on a unique moment in Spain. The country was at the end of General Francisco Franco's dictatorship and beginning a slow transition towards democracy. Middle-class families were navigating the anxieties of a rapidly changing culture, and so they placed a premium on order, discipline, and outdoor activities designed to keep their youth away from political radicalism and street crime. Eddie saw this vulnerability and presented himself as the solution, a highly respectable, morally upright mentor. He began a recruitment in an affluent area of Madrid. He would embed himself within Catholic parishes and prestigious private schools so he could bypass the skepticism of parents. He was articulate, he dressed well, and he spoke passionately about rescuing urban youth from the creeping dangers of modern materialism. Parents handed their children over to him, convinced their sons were joining an elite character-building survivalist club that would forge them into upstanding young men. Eddie's strategy was predatory. He exclusively recruited young boys between the ages of 10 and 13. To avoid police detection and manage the sheer amount of his victims, Eddie structured Edelweiss through a series of front organizations. Each layer represented a deeper level of indoctrination, allowing to filter out non-compliant children while isolating the most vulnerable. The Youth Association of Edelweiss Mountain was a rigorous mountaineering and outdoor social club. This front was where physical exhaustion and sleep deprivation were used to weaken psychological defenses. There was the Green Berets, which was an elite tier for the most dedicated and physically capable youths. This structure required intense loyalty tests, isolation from family, and total obedience to Eddie. And the Iron Guard, which was the inner circle of fully indoctrinated lieutenants and victims turned abusers who managed the cult and enforced Eddie's will. Eddie manipulated the minds of these children through classical conditioning. The boys were made to feel exceptional. They were told they were a chosen elite preparing for a grand destiny that ordinary humans could never comprehend. The grueling physical demands of the mountain camps, forced marches through freezing rain, sleep deprivation, and dangerous survival tests served to break down their will. Once physically shattered, they became entirely dependent on Eddie for emotional validation. Once their physical and psychological isolation was complete, Eddie introduced the esoteric framework that would bind the boys to him with psychological chains. He weaponized the era's fascination with UFOs and space exploration, blending it with fascist ideology to create a terrifying theology. Eddie revealed a highly classified secret to his most dedicated followers. He was not a human from Madrid, but an extraterrestrial prince named Alain. He claimed he came from a distant, highly advanced planetary system, referred to within the cult's shifting lore as the planet Delhais, the asteroid Nathan, or the cosmic empire of Delos. Eddie claimed the Earth was a corrupt, doomed planet slated for absolute destruction by a nuclear cataclysm in the year 1992. The impending doom was because of human failure and also because of the design of a dark cosmic entity referred to in the cult's broader alien lore as Mallow. It was an antagonistic force bringing chaos to the galaxy. He told the boys that they had been specifically chosen because their souls resonated with the pure frequency of Delos. The rigorous mountain training was framed as vital preparation for cosmic evacuation. When the apocalypse arrived, a fleet of extraterrestrial spacecraft would descend to rescue the loyal members of the Edelweiss Iron Guard, transporting them off the doomed Earth to the utopian world of Delhais. This apocalyptic story was potent, and it was a big part of the coercive control. If a child questioned the harsh treatment, the SA, and the isolation from his family, he was doing more than just questioning a scoutmaster. He was risking his very survival in the coming global annihilation. Eddie held the only ticket off a dying world, and disobedience meant being left behind to burn. The most insidious aspect of Edelweiss was that Eddie taught the boys that on Delhais, society was perfect, and this perfection was achieved through an exclusively all-male civilization. Women were categorized as biologically and spiritually imperfect. The doctrine dictated that the only pure and ideal form of love was between the older, enlightened alien mentors and the younger, developing human children. This was a predatory system designed to groom children and justify institutionalized child SA. The SA was framed as a sacred cosmic rite of passage, a transfer of energetic data required to elevate the boys' consciousness to the level needed for the journey to Delos. To refuse Eddie's advances was to reject salvation. The Edelweiss cult created psychological devastation. A destructive cult operates by actively dismantling the pre-existing personality. Eddie achieved this through total environmental control. The boys were physically exhausted through mountain marches that bordered on torture. Sleep deprivation weakened their cognitive resistance. Once in a state of exhaustion, they were subjected to long hypnotic indoctrination sessions around campfires, where Eddie would weave his tales of alien worlds, Emperor Mallow, and impending doom. The second phase of coercive persuasion involved severing the emotional ties to the outside world. Eddie demanded that the boys view their biological families as dangerous earthly attachments that would tether them to the doomed planet. Parents who attempted to intervene or pull their children out of the group were labeled as enemies of the cosmic order. The group enforced absolute information control. The boys were surrounded by an atmosphere of paranoia and constant surveillance. An eternal informant system was established. Boys were required to write intelligence reports on one another, ensuring that no one could express doubt without fear of being reported to the Iron Guard. To maintain control over this network, which was rapidly expanding, at its height had over 400 boys and had branches all over Spain, Eddie required an officer class. Membership in the Iron Guard required a fanatical oath. He sought to take certain victims and make them the enforcers. The most prominent lieutenants in the organization were inducted into Edelweiss as innocent prepubescent boys. Under Eddie's unrelenting psychological pressure and SA, their moral compasses were completely shattered. As they aged into adolescence, Eddie rewarded them with power and absolute authority over the younger recruits. They became Eddie's enforcers, managing the camps, conducting the intense physical punishments, and ultimately participating in the abuse of the new generation of boys. This dynamic is typical of highly destructive cults, ensuring that the lieutenants are too deeply implicated in the organization's crimes to ever turn to the authorities. They are bound to the leader by shared guilt. Eddie operated the group as both a hunting ground for his deviance, but also as a highly lucrative extortion racket. Parents were required to pay exorbitant fees for specialized mountain gear, uniforms, and expeditions. The organization established a complex financial infrastructure, moving money through various accounts to fund Eddie's increasingly lavish lifestyle. When the parents questioned the costs, Eddie used his manipulation tactics, leveraging the boys against their own families. A boy heavily indoctrinated by Edelweiss would violently defend the organization, demanding his parents pay the fees, otherwise he would be expelled from the Green Berets and left to die in the 1992 apocalypse. Despite having a lot of internal control, cracks began to show. In 1982, authorities caught up with Eddie, resulting in a conviction and a 6-year prison sentence for the corruption of minors. However, the Spanish penal system at the time failed to recognize the cult nature of the threat. Eddie served only a fraction of his sentence and was released almost immediately. His brief time in jail did not dismantle Edelweiss. It rallied it. During his absence, his lieutenants maintained the iron-fisted control of the camps, proving that the cult could function on its own. Upon his release in the spring of 1983, Eddie returned with a vengeance. He reorganized the mountain groups, tightened security, and escalated the abuse, gathering a new crop of boys aged 11 to 14 and indoctrinating them with even more extreme practices designed to satisfy his deviant appetites. The turning point arrived in the fall of 1984. The sheer scale of the operation began to overwhelm Eddie's ability to control the narrative. Boys who had managed to escape the psychological grip of the cult began to speak out. A coalition of desperate parents, journalists, and whistleblowers began compiling evidence of the rampant abuse, physical torture, and financial extortion taking place in the mountains. The public pressure mounted, and Spanish authorities launched a massive investigation. Realizing that the net was closing and that his political contacts could no longer protect him, Eddie initiated a contingency plan known internally as Operation Ocean. The objective was to flee Spain, establishing a new base of operations in Portugal or further abroad, expanding the international scope of his PDF network, and evading the jurisdiction of Spanish police. Eddie and his top lieutenants crossed the border, evading the initial sweep of Spanish law enforcement. However, their flight was short-lived. In mid-November 1984, the authorities struck. A massive raid in Lisbon resulted in the arrest of Eduardo González Arenas and 10 of his primary lieutenants. At that same time, the headquarters in Madrid and the various regional camps were shut down by Spanish police. Investigators recovered troves of documents, neo-Nazi paraphernalia, and dossiers containing the psychological profile and abuse records of hundreds of children. Edelweiss had finally been dragged into the cold light of the justice system. It took 7 years for the Spanish judicial system to untangle the massive web of abuse, extortion, and manipulation. Finally, in October 1991, the trial began in Madrid. It was one of the largest and most complex trials involving a cult and the corruption of minors in European history. More than 24 victims took the stand. Many of the victims had spent years in intensive psychiatric therapy. They faced their former abusers, testifying to the depravity of the initiation rites, the physical abuse, and the systemic sexual violence that was masked as cosmic enlightenment. The prosecution was horrified by the scale of atrocities and initially demanded a sentence of over 450 years in prison for the cult leader, charging him with 75 crimes. The final verdict handed down by the tribunal showed the limitations of the court system when faced with the mechanics of a cult. The court convicted all 10 defendants. Eduardo González Arenas was found guilty of 28 separate crimes of corruption of minors and was sentenced to 168 years in prison. His two primary enforcers were sentenced to 65 years each. However, the massive years that they were sentenced to masked the reality. Because the crimes were committed under the old Spanish penal code, the maximum cumulative time a convict could actually serve in prison for these types of crimes was capped. The 168-year sentence was entirely symbolic. In early 1997, Eduardo González Arenas, the architect of the nightmare, the man sentenced to 168 years for destroying the lives of hundreds of children, was granted early release for good behavior. He served exactly 6 years behind bars. Eddie walked out of prison in January 1997 a free man. He would relocate to Ibiza. He opened a bar in a small town, attempting to blend into the vibrant transient culture. Almost immediately, the predatory patterns reemerged. Eddie began surrounding himself with young, vulnerable boys. In June 1997, just months after his release, he was arrested again, following complaints from parents that he had SA'd 3 minors. In a failure of the judicial system, he was released a few days later, citing a lack of definitive physical evidence. He believed he had outsmarted the laws that he so deeply despised, but the trauma he had seeded over a decade was about to catch up with him in a brutally violent fashion. Juan Martin Garcia had been subjected to Eddie's psychological torture and SA. The judicial system had failed to protect him as a boy, and the 1991 trial had failed to deliver lasting justice. Watching his abuser walk free after 6 years and seeing him immediately return to preying on children in Ibiza with absolute impunity triggered a psychological snap. On the evening of September 1st, 1998, Juan Martin Garcia tracked Eddie down on a street in Ibiza. He was armed with a knife and confronted the self-proclaimed extraterrestrial prince. Garcia slit Eduardo González Arenas' throat, leaving the founder of the Edelweiss cult to bleed to death in the street. Garcia was arrested, confessed to the murder, and in 1999 was sentenced to 17 years in prison. The victim who took the life of a prolific predator received a sentence that would ultimately keep him in jail nearly 3 times longer than the psychopath who had destroyed his childhood. Eduardo's death ended Edelweiss, but he's not the only cult leader hiding in plain sight. If you think his mind control was disturbing, you need to see what happens inside the Order of Nine Angles. Click the video on your screen right now, and I'll see you there.